Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our guests. Appreciate you all being here today. It's a beautiful Sabbath day. I'd like you to take your Bibles, and I'd like you to open them up to Psalms, and we're going to look at Psalm chapter 4 today. We're going to read. Let's read through this first, and then we'll talk about Psalm 4. So, Psalm chapter 4, if you're there, we're going to start off in verse 1. Verse 1 of Psalm chapter 4. And here at the beginning it says, "Answer me when I call it." It says, "To the choir master, the stringed instruments, a psalm of David." So this is set to a song. "Answer me when I call, O God, of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my glory be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your hearts on your beds, and be silent, Selah. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, 'Who will show us good?' Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." Here we have a Psalm of David. And the last time I gave a sermon at, we learned that the psalm before this one, in Psalm chapter 3, was called a morning psalm. It was a psalm that David sang in the morning in thanksgiving for God for vanquishing his enemies. And in particular, it was Absalom, if you remember, who was seeking to dethrone David and take the kingdom for himself. But here in Psalm 4, we come to a psalm that's considered an evening psalm. So in contrast to 3, which was a morning, this is an evening psalm, and it seems likely that it should be paired with Psalm 3 as a type of doublet, which should be played on the same day. Psalm 3 sung in the morning, and then Psalm 4 then sung in the evening. But both of them being played on stringed instruments, as it says here at the beginning of the psalm. Now, Psalm 4 breaks down into 3 particular parts here. So this is part 1 we're going to discuss here right now. The first part is verse 1. And verse 1 is an introduction where David seeks an audience with God and praises him for the relief he was given while undergoing his trial with Absalom. And I want you to notice in the beginning that David has a bold proclamation. He says, "Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness." Now, this seems far too bold of a demand on the surface to tell God to answer. But I think it's important to understand that this is a relationship that David had with our God, where David was boldly going before the throne of grace, not out of disrespect, but of knowing the kind of God that he is. God actually says in Psalm 91:15, you don't need to turn there, that he will call on me and I will answer him. That's what he says. And then he also tells us in Jeremiah 33, verse 3, "Call unto me and I will answer you." So David is really just reiterating back to God what he was told to do and what God will then do when we call upon him. So David calls him the God of my righteousness here, which means rather, "O my righteous God." And this was sort of a common expression of the day in the Hebrew. For instance, "Hill of my holiness" is something in Psalm chapter 2. That means my holy hill. So David says, "Answer me when I call, O my righteous God." And in that answer, God provides relief for David as he pleaded for continued answers to his prayers. Now the next is part 2. Part 2 is verses 2 to 5. And David turns now his attention to addressing his enemies and his fellow countrymen that were in sin against David, or in sin and I should say against David. Now these men were clearly seeking to degrade King David by turning his glory into shame. Now this could mean a few things. I'm going to give you some possibilities here. Number one, this could mean that they were using propaganda, right, to turn the nation of Israel against King David. We see this, that people try to do this. They try to use false statements to turn others against, the king or the president or whoever it may be. in order to bring shame that he was the king. And much as like a business board, for instance, they might say things that are wrong to try and turn the board against the president. This would be something like that through propaganda. There's another possibility, fighting for control of his kingdom when he had it for so long could be considered a shame upon him as well. Well, why would this king who has had this kingdom for so long, now he's fighting for his kingdom after so many years? Well, this is kind of a shameful thing. You can't keep control of your kingdom. Like, in other words, saying that he's not an effective leader. This would be possible. Or it could mean it's shameful that his son Absalom would rebel against him, which was a shame to him as a father, the glory of his son. Now, let me give you a couple proverbs that could lend to this. Proverbs 17, verse 6, it says this: "Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers." So this would be against that glory. Proverbs 15, verse 20 says, "A wise son gladdens his father, and a foolish son is the shame of his mother." So it could be something of that nature. Now, I think David had recognized the shame that Absalom had brought upon him, but also from the others in the nation who had rebelled against him. And David was expressing in poetic terms to his enemies that it didn't matter what they did. God was going to set him apart for righteousness, for himself. And God would hear his own when they called upon him. God was going to listen to David. This is what he's telling them. You can think back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they expressed to King Nebuchadnezzar the same idea, that no matter what the king did to them, that they would not be overtaken by him, and God would deliver them out of the hand of the king. They said that in absolute terms, but they also said it in life or death. It didn't matter, but either way, they weren't going to serve him. We're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 by the Apostle Paul that God will always make an escape for us when we're surrounded by our enemies. And just as he did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God sets apart the godly. And that's you. That's each and every one of you. He sets you apart for himself, that he will hear you when you call upon his name, and he will answer you in your time of need. Now, David in verses 4 and 5 goes so far as to call these evil men to consider their ways. He's saying this to the evil men: I want you to consider your ways in deep reflection. Now, deep reflection often comes in the evening, after you've gone through the whole day, and you sit down and you lie in your bed and you be quiet. Oftentimes you will reflect upon the day. And David calls on these men to do this and to repent. The King James reads in Psalm chapter 4 and verse 4, "Stand in awe and sin not." The Aramaic paraphrase renders it, "Tremble before him and sin not." And the Latin Vulgate in the Septuagint reads this, "Be angry and sin not." So Paul is quoting this principle in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. He says, "Be angry and sin not." But it seems that the general idea here is connected more to fear than to anger, though it doesn't particularly preclude anger. But the connection with fear is that the evildoers should be fearful of God and not sin anymore. He's upon them to do that. In fact, David writes in verse 4 to take time. He calls upon the sinners, everyone, to take time to consider what is in your heart while you're in your bed at night. In other words, they should commune with their hearts and consult their better judgments to determine if this is the best course of direction for their lives. The psalmist then puts in the Selah, and you'll see that there a couple times. And this is a notation of pause, a pause in the song that would give the audience a moment to ponder. If you listen to a song and there's a pause in there, that's the opportunity for your mind to just wait, listen, what was I just listening to? What does that mean? And even if it's just for a moment, your mind will go through that and just think about what you've just heard. So he's saying, stop, be still, and consider. Poetically, as the evil man considers in his bed, you should consider while you're listening to the song. And then when you've considered, what do? You turn. You turn from your evil way that you've done. And he's saying this to the evil person. And you consider yourself how you apply your life to God, and then put your trust in Him and not in yourself. Now, the third part is part three. And that is in Psalm chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. So David now turns his attention back to God and now says to Him, and about mankind in general, all right, this is about what this is, mankind in general, that many look for good. So this is what man looks for. Many look for good. And they are looking for goodness. This world is looking for goodness. You'll see it all around you. They're looking for goodness somewhere. They're looking for happiness. Everybody wants to be happy. And they're looking for meaning. Everyone wants meaning in their lives. They're looking for something in their lives to fill that space up. And the first part of verse 6 is what the worldly man is saying. Who will show us good? And the second part of verse 6 is what the godly man is desiring. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. All right, so you got two things going on here. Right? The worldly man saying, where's the good? The godly man says, lift your light upon me, O Lord. Because the godly man knows that the light of God, the face of God, the relationship of God is what brings true happiness. That's where happiness comes from. That's where it is. In fact, David affirms this in the next verse, in verse 7, that it is God who has put gladness in his heart. So you see, the children of the world can increase in grain and corn and wine. And that's what you'll read there. Right? They can increase. In other words, they can increase in wealth. They can increase in money. The businessman can increase his savings account to millions of dollars. And he can buy cars that drive really fast. And he can buy planes that will travel to the ends of the earth. And it'll exhilarate the senses. Or the best clothes. Or the best shoes. Or the best food that money can buy. But at the end of the day, David says that the gladness is not from all those things. He says the gladness in his heart is from God, who outpaces all of those worldly things. Do you ever find yourself at night lying awake, sometimes trying to work things out in your head? You're worried about things. I've lied awake at night before. I think this is... Some people have this issue more than others, obviously, but I find myself lying awake worrying about some problem maybe at work that's going on. And it's often about, man, I sure hope this next quarter is good enough to pay the bills, or to, whatever it is to pay the issue, or if you have a problem with an employee, well, I sure hope this works out. Or if you have a problem with a family member, you worry about these things. These are things that we can lay in our bed and worry about at night. And it makes it difficult sometimes to get a restful sleep. And maybe there are things that you worry about too that kind of steal your joy and gladness from you. And you find particularly maybe there are health difficulties that challenges you mentally and physically, and they challenge you spiritually. Well, these are all enemies. That's what these are. David's talking about his enemies. This is what all these are. These are enemies that surround us. And they would love nothing more, because Satan uses those, to turn your glory into shame. Enemies that lie and enemies that attempt to put a wedge between you and God. That's what they are. But if we listen to Psalm 4, it does not have to. It doesn't have to do that. All we need to do is call on God, and He will answer in His good timing, in His good will. So I'd like you to go boldly, as David did, before the throne of God, because you have this relationship with Him in time of need, and He will shine His countenance upon you, and He will put gladness in your heart, so that when you lay down at night, there will be peace, without worry, without care, and you will sleep knowing that God is the one who keeps you safe, no matter what, in life or in death. God will always be there for you in good times and bad times. Brethren, you can rest in God.